Livingston Parish was a part of St. Helena Civil Parish until 1832, when Livingston Parish was created as a separate parish. Tangipahoa was created from a portion of Livingston Parish in 1869. By 1840, total population of Livingston Parish was 2,315 residents. Prior to the coming of the East-West Railroad in Baton Rouge to Hammond in 1907-08, transportation was provided by horse, wagon, mules, and schooners. Schooners provided transportation to New Orleans via the Netalbany River onto Lake Maurepas and Lake Pontchartrain to parts beyond. Principal occupation of the early settlers was farming, livestock raising, cattle were free roaming. Livingston Parish is a microcosm of the state. The southern part of the state was settled by French, Germans, and Spanish, while the north was settled by Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Because of the ethnic settlement, we have French settlement and later Hungarian settlement. Historically, Livingston Parish had the second fewest slaves in 1860.
The area, of course, was primitive and undeveloped, that it was primarily timbered, and there was a few subsistence farmers that raised cattle and enough corn to support themselves and their animals.
Brackenridge was one of the first northern commercial lumber companies to migrate to the south to continue harvesting lumber. They acquired large tracts of virgin timberlands in Louisiana and Mississippi, including Livingston Parish and the surrounding area. They located the sawmill in what became Hungarian settlement. They utilized a small narrow-gauge railroad in their logging operations. Since the sawmill was not located on a commercial railroad, they had to transport lumber by rail to Springfield on the spur of railway known as the dummy line, because it went nowhere to deliver lumber for shipment elsewhere. The Florine carrying finished lumber to market at the port city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Brackenridge did not practice reforestation. Instead, he believed in the motto, cut out and get out. Hungarians benefited from this idea. The land was surveyed into 20-acre tracts to be sold. Brackenridge Lumber allowed the Hungarians to buy this cut-over land and let them pay for it each month over time from their sawmill salary. Land usually sold for about $4 per acre. This benefited everyone. Brackenridge could get rid of the now worthless land and recover some of his investment, and the Hungarians could buy the needed land for their new farms.
When they was working with the mill, that provided income for them, and then when they started farming the strawberries, of course, that provided a annual income to the farmers.
In 1896, the area was being settled, and 3 mill workers worked closely with Brackenridge Lumber to promote and encourage Hungarians to come to this area. It was mutually beneficial for both parties to settle here. Founders advertised in Northern Hungarian language newspapers to persuade Hungarians to come. Hungarians who worked in the northern industrial complexes and eastern mines were looking for a way out and a piece of land on which to farm, for they yearned to return to their old way of life in the old country, farming.
Hungarians were attracted to this area because there was available land and employment that was provided by the Brackenridge Lumber Company. And when the company cut out, when they had exhausted their timber supply, the Hungarians were able to purchase the cut-over timberland.
Arpadhon, a settlement in southeast Louisiana, began around 1896. Hungarian immigrants came from the old country of Hungary and Eastern Europe during the 1800s. Due to many wars, food shortages, strife, tyranny, and harsh government incarcerations, Hungarian citizens left their homes in the country of Hungary and settled in the northern cities of the United States. At the turn of the 20th century, these immigrants were enticed by letters from friends, family members, and all who worked in the sawmill here in Louisiana, and from Northern Hungary language newspaper ads to once again leave their homes and jobs where they worked in heavy industry and coal mines in the northern cities. These Hungarians came here to work in the Brackenridge Lumber sawmill and saw the great opportunity to buy the cutover land and establish a community here in southeast Louisiana. Since they were an agrarian people, they yearned to own and work their own farms and live free in the fresh air.
This area south of Albany became known as Arpadhon, which was the Hungarian name for the Hungarian settlement. But since the name was hard to pronounce for the non-Hungarians, it quickly became known and still is known as the Hungarian settlement.
As immigrants came to this desolate cutover land, there were no buildings except the Brackenridge Lumber sawmill and its few outer buildings. Being a rural area, there was no community surrounding the mill to support the growing number of mill workers and their families. A place to lodge these workers became extremely significant. Consequently, Brackenridge Lumber hurriedly built the immigration house, a large two-story wooden multi-purpose structure, as temporary living quarters for their mill employees.
The immigration house was a structure that provided housing and shelter for the early Hungarian immigrants that came here because they had no permanent homes. So the mill had provided the construction materials that enabled the Hungarians to have a place to live while they built their own homes. And the immigration house also provided a place for the religious services because there was no churches at the beginning in the settlement. The immigration house provided a location for the immigrants to live while they were constructing their own home, and it was a community center that prior to the construction of the churches, religious services were held at the immigration house. And began to farm the crop that had been grown in the area. It was strawberries, and they were able to expand the production of strawberries because the cutover land was a acidic soil which was conducive to growing strawberries. And the strawberries was a cash crop that was able to be transported by the railroads to particularly northern cities like Chicago. The daily life of the Hungarians in the settlement was initially very primitive because there was no electricity, of course, no running water, et cetera. And they were able to, of course, improve the conditions, over time. And of course, with education, they were able to grow and prosper here in the Hungarian settlement. It's important that the history be preserved because, of course, it's the largest rural Hungarian settlement in the U.S. And of course, the old adage that if you don't know, the history, you're destined to, have to repeat it. So it's important that the current residents know the conditions that their ancestors lived under, and that the obstacles that they had to overcome in making it a productive community here in the Hungarian settlement.